I'm Professor Lee Sharnick-Udemans. I work here at the University of the Western Cape in the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice. I am a scholar of religion who is interested in the political economy of media, and I use the categories of privilege and power in order to interrogate the ways in which religions that are deemed different or deviant are subjected to undue scrutiny and suspicion. The University of the Western Cape, since apartheid, has been known as the home of the intellectual left, or the intellectual home of the left. It is, and that history is something that we hold very dear. This is a space where we don't shy away from issues related to social justice, and where academia is not just about doing empty scholarship, but really about trying to make the world a better place through the work that we do as academics. So the reason I took the opportunity to speak with you today from this particular location is because the case of Chairman Lee's imprisonment is not some distant political issue taking place across the world that is of no concern to us here in South Africa. The detention and the detainment of Chairman Lee is extremely important for us to take notice of and for us to make a statement against, because it reveals to us how fragile the systems that we all hold so dear are. And those systems are things like freedom of religion and freedom of expression, as well as free political participation. From my position as a scholar of religion, I see religious freedom and the right to a fair trial as inseparable. These are not two separate rights or two separate areas of religious or political activity. And I think that we sometimes work on the assumption that religion can be separated from other parts of public life. That in fact is not true. And when we rest on that assumption, I think that's when things become quite problematic. So when a 95-year-old man is detained and imprisoned for a non-violent offense that still has not been proven, it really shows up and brings up for scrutiny the ways in which the most vulnerable members of society, not just in terms of age, but in terms of those who operate outside of the borders of privilege, the risks that those communities are facing. And so when we consider the fact that Chairman Lee is 95 years old, that the offense that he stands accused of is a non-violent offense, but also an offense that brings up for scrutiny the very ways in which we are allowed to participate in democracy, not only as political subjects, but also as religious subjects, I think we need to become very concerned with the ways in which universal rights are being interpreted, in particular contexts, but not just contexts outside of our own, also within our own context as South Africans. Apartheid is one of the clearest examples of the entanglement of religion and politics, right? And that's a very intimate, painful part of South Africa's history, and its connection to unjust detention and the suppression of religious freedom are parts of our history that unfortunately have often got swept under the rug, because we've focused more on issues related and very important issues related to race and to gender. But the idea of religious suppression and unjust detention during apartheid is something that is very important for us to discuss. And I think that the reason it's especially important is because the connection between politics and religion was not magically dissolved by the adoption of the 1996 Constitution. And the legacy of apartheid, while very much rested in Christian nationalism, we can see many aspects of it echoed in what I call the Christo-normativity, or the continued privilege of Christianity within South African society, despite its multicultural, its constitutionally protected status of religious freedom and as a semi-secular state. So I think why it's important for us to reflect on our history as a country in relation to what's happening in South Korea is that unjust detention and the suppression of religious diversity, of religious pluralism, religious difference and deviance, it sometimes isn't a very kind of loud exciting piece of news. It starts in incremental ways, and those incremental ways really begin when religious minority communities begin to feel unsafe. Whether that is within the political discourse, whether that is within media narratives, or whether that is within the ways they are being engaged with in the interpersonal relationships that take place in public on a daily basis. So South Africa is a semi-secular state. We have a constitution that protects religious freedom, freedom of expression, and all the other rights that are associated with religion and belief, right? But we don't have a strict wall of separation between the state and religion. And I think that's really important, because when there's a strict wall of separation between the state and religion, we give space, or we allow space for the idea that there is a possibility of neutrality. And in moments of injustice and in moments of crisis, I think that neutrality is an extremely dangerous position to take, because when people's lives are being compromised, when people's safety is being compromised, then the notion of neutrality actually becomes quite dehumanizing. I think that my message as a scholar who is also an activist is that we need to be very suspicious when governments and states interfere with the interior lives of religious communities, whether that is in the area of theology or whether that is in the area of political participation, such as the case of Chairman Lee and his religious community. Because when the rights and the agency of religious communities to participate both as religious and political subjects and citizens, when those rights are limited, when those rights are treated with suspicion, it means that so many of the other fundamental rights that hold up the promise of democracy for us also come under fire. I'm not trying to be alarmist and make the claim that, the violation of one right means that all the rest will crumble, but I do want to say that our democracies are far more fragile than we even imagine. And so it is absolutely important for us to be extremely critical when it comes to state interference with religious communities' ability to exercise their agency and their freedom to participate within the political and public sphere. So I think it's important for scholars of religion and for scholars studying topics related to religion, such as theology and spirituality, to speak up and openly on these issues for two particular reasons. The first is that freedom of religion is a core tenet of democracy. If we allow for freedom of religion to be eroded, then we are actually allowing for power to take up spaces that belong to people. The second reason I think it's so important for scholars to speak up is because the study of humanity is the study of religion. Religion is one of those areas of human life where what it means to be human is a fundamental question. And if religious communities are not allowed within reason, within rule of law, within the context of universal rights, if religious communities are not allowed to express their agency across the various spheres of life, then we are going to develop a very, very skewed view of human history, one that is a shadow and not the story of the full expression of who we are as humanity. My final message is that we need to acknowledge the fragility of freedom of religion and democracy. These are not self-sustaining abstract concepts. These are lived realities. And when the state interferes with how these lived realities are experienced and interpreted by religious communities, then I think we need to pay very, very close attention, because it calls into question the very principles that we rely on in order for us to stay human in a world that is more and more becoming less and less humane. In order to protect the fragility of religious freedom and the sacrality of democracy, I believe that as responsible citizens and ethical scholars, we should demand that Chairman Lee be granted a fair trial without prolonged detention.